now in Romans chapter 13, the first part of it, we deal with the duty to governments. Whether it be as the government of the land where you're living or you're part of, or governments around the world. And we have a lot of opinions about governments, but we want to see what God has for us. First of all, he talks about that we're to be subject under your government. Where that you're living and the nation you're in, you're to be subject to your nation. So in Romans 13:1, the Bible tells us, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no other power but of God, but the power that be are ordained of God. Now, that's a pretty powerful verse, and to understand that, we want to look at three words that's involved in that. We want to look at the word subject and see what God is talking about when He tells us to be in subject to the higher power. We want to look at the word powers as to what is that referring to in this passage, and then we want to look at the word ordained. So in this passage, these three words give us an understanding of what God is telling us in this particular passage that's on there. As we look at the first word, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. The word subject, this is the Greek word that is used for it, and it's huptazo, and it's a Greek military term. It means to arrange, or like troop divisions in military fashion, under the command of a leader. So as if you was in the military, as you would follow the command, when they would tell you to fall in and whatever, on that's being subject to them. You might not agree with those of you and want to argue with them, but you don't. And it's a matter that you recognize your rank, your position, and what your duties are involved in. It also means, in non-military use, there was a voluntary attitude of giving in, cooperating, assuming responsibility, and carrying a burden. So to be subject to the higher powers means that we cooperate with the government. We cooperate with the higher power. We fulfill our responsibilities that we might have under that government or that whatever is assigned in this. It's not a matter of being in total obedience. Though obedience is involved in it, but you're recognizing the authority of the government and recognizing the order and the functions that are there for a particular purpose that you might be involved in, or how the government is working in this. So keep that in mind as we think about this. Then in Titus 3:1, the same word is used, subject, is used here. It says, put them in mind to be subject to principalities and powers, and to obey magistrates, and be ready to every good work. This verse also gives us a definition, as we'll talk about in a moment, of powers. And that word powers is dealing with principalities and magistrates. It's talking about governmental officials or government officials that we are to be subject to or to recognize their position. In 1 Peter 2, verse 13, that same word is used here and translated submit. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme. So again, the emphasis that God is over and over again telling us that we're to be subject, we're to recognize the authority of the governments, or the government that we're part of, as well as the other governments of the world. When I took a group to Uganda, Africa, I told them, I said, now, we're American citizens. We're not citizens of these countries we're going into, especially Uganda, but you recognize their laws. Just because you're not a citizen of that country doesn't mean you can ignore their laws. You're to be subject, in other words, to their laws. And we're to keep that in mind, that we're just not free to do whatever we want to. We're to be subject to whatever government we're involved with or that we live within that. Or, it goes on to say, or unto governors, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of them that do well. 1 Peter 2:15, for so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free and not using your liberty as the folk of not maliciousness, but as the servants of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Now, here we see in this verse and the verse prior to this, one of the reasons that God has the governments is to keep order among mankind and to have some dignity of life involved in that. And so, as we are subject to the governments, whether they believe the same thing we believe, whether they're a different opinion of faith or whatever might involve it, still yet God has them there for a purpose. And when we are subject to them and obey the laws and dealing with our relationship with one another, not how we worship God, but in how we deal with one another, then we are doing the will of God, and that with well-doing you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. So we have a witness and a testimony for God when we are subject and recognize the authority of the governments that we're in and that we deal with on that. We'll be talking about that a little bit more in this. 1 Peter 2:18 and 19, servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the fallen. And of course here the same thought is given in a job that you might have. And that your boss, you are hired by that individual to do a particular task. And you need to do it to the best of your ability. And that you might not agree with everything in that, but that's what you're hired for. And if you don't want to involve in that, then resign, get another job. I work with that. But as Christians, you do your best with this. And so the word subject is used in that. But this is thankworthy. If a man for conscience toward God endureth grief, suffering wrongfully. Now sometimes you're in a position where that in being subject and what you're doing, as you take a stand for that which that might be right within that, and you suffer for it. Well, then this is what he's talking about. Is God says this is thankworthy if a man for conscience toward God endureth grief, but you will also take the punishment. You'll not fight against that. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Verse 20, for what glory is it if when you're buffeted for your faults, you shall take it patiently, but if ye, when you do well and suffer for it, you take it patiently, this is acceptable with God. And so if you make a mistake, if you rebel for something of your own doing and suffer for it, you need to. But if you're having to suffer because of your relationship with God, then this is a witness and a testimony, and take that punishment or that persecution that might come with it. For even here too, where you call, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. Now we're going to be involved in governments that do not believe in our God. We're going to be involved in governments that do not believe in Jesus. We're going to be involved in jobs that have little respect for our beliefs or anything else. As we live in this world, we're going to be involved in all kinds of situations like that just to exist. Not by choice, but to exist, to have an income, to put food on your table, or to in a particular nation that you might be involved in. And in that, and so to be involved in that, as we're in that, there are times when we need to take our stand for our beliefs, and we do so and we'll be persecuted. And if you're called to, in these areas, there needs to be a witness and a testimony. Doesn't mean it's going to be accepted. I've shared this with you before, but let me share it with you again. I've had people, as a pastor, that would come up to me and said, pray that I can find a job where there's all Christian workers in there. Where I'm at now, there's no Christian workers, and man, it's rough in there with this. They don't like my beliefs. They don't agree with me on this, and it's really difficult. And I said, no, I'm not going to pray for that. They kind of look at me a little bit, and I said, the reason why is because you need to be a witness there. What good is your light if it's amongst those that are all Christians? And over here, these that are lost don't have a light in it. And so this is what this is talking about. Even though we might be persecuted, we need to be that witness in that government or that job or that position that is there, recognizing the authority of those positions that are there and working within that, but not compromising our beliefs on them. 1 Peter 2:22, talking about Jesus, who did no sin, neither was God found in his mouth. He set the example for us. Who, when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judges righteously. And so Jesus didn't have to submit to the Roman government. He's king. He's creator. But he did. And then as came into the time of persecution, he didn't fight back. He could have called down the legions of angels. He could have done all kinds of things, but he didn't do that. Even though we're free, and we have the power of God in certain areas and working in that, yet we're to have that witness and testimony that is as we take our stand, recognizing the different parts of the government on there. Now, God helps the people of the world through governments. And this is something that we forget about quite a bit involved in this. And we find this in Romans 13:1, that every soul be subject to the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. We looked at the word subject, and now we want to look at the word powers, and then we'll look at the word ordained here in a moment. In the matter of powers, of higher powers, recognizing what God has set in place of organization, of different governments, of different positions on this, the bottom line is there's nobody greater than God. And so we recognize there is no power but of God. All of these powers under God are there because God permitted it. And just as Jesus talked to Pilate, when Pilate said, "Do you know who you're talking to?" when he was trying him and asked him to defend himself, and he wouldn't say anything. He said, "Don't you realize I've got power to take life or give life? I can kill someone or spare their life," and so on as my position in this government position. And Jesus answered, "You have no power but what God gives you." And so regardless of this, even though we might have a government that is totally against our beliefs, that would like to destroy us, get rid of us, whatever the case might be, we realize that we serve the one who's got more power than that government. And right now in America, we're seeing the attitude of most of our leaders are wanting to get away from God. Well, I got news for you. God is greater than that. And if we'll be faithful and have the witness and testimony, we can bring it back. Now, we have a privilege above what most nations have, and that is we can elect our officials. And we're fixing to have another election. And so we can put in, and so those that are in the position they're in our government, regardless of who they are, they're there because we as Americans put them there. And so the blame is not on them, it's on us. We can make that change in there. But while they're in position, we might not like what they're doing, but we have a responsibility to our government. And we still take our stand as Christians and working in this, and we'll deal with it. But here we're recognizing that the powers is dealing with governments. Here it uses the word power, dealing with God, the powers that be. The powers that be, as we'll see later on, are those put in order by God on it. So the word power means governmental authority, is what this particular word that is used here and translated as powers on it. So in Romans 13:3, it says, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise the same." The reason why I brought this out, the word is power, used in relation to rulers. It's the same Greek word here, and here's defined it as government officials, as those in government position on that. And so as we see that, then in Romans 13:6 and 7, "For this cause pay you tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." And so this power is talking about those in governmental positions, the governments of our nations, of our world, those in authority of as far as our workspace or whatever else we might have involved with that. So in Psalm 62:11, now For God has spoken once, twice have I heard this, that power belongeth unto God. This is the underlining factor. This is what keeps our sanity, so to speak. This is what gives us hope. Regardless of what type of government we have, God has great power. And God has not forgotten us and will not forget us in that. And so now, sometimes we bring this on ourselves. We allow people in, or we elect people that we thought was right and is not right, and we bring it upon ourselves, and God will let us suffer with that for a while, but not destroy us. We'll stand up and be Christians as we ought to and take our stand with it. So in Romans 13:1, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Now this word, as we looked at subjects and powers, and now we want to look at ordained of God. In that, the word ordained, the Greek word that is used there, is tasso, and that means to put in certain order. To put in certain order. The governments didn't just happen. All the governments of the world was put in order by God. God set it up for that purpose, as we'll see in a little bit, in working with this. So in Proverbs 8:15 and 16, by me, God says, kings reign and princes decree justice. No king's really going to be there unless God ordained it, put it in order, unless God also approves it in that, and He has. He says, I've brought up kings, I've taken them out. I've brought up princes, I've taken them out. If they're not staying within the boundaries that He sets on them, and the boundaries are pretty large with this, and working within man's free will. And God's not going to override our free will. He's going to let us have our choice, and many times for us to learn the lesson, He lets us wallow in the mess we make.
Amen.
You know, in that part of it. So if you don't like it, then straighten up and do what God tells you to do to begin with. And when we come down to it, well, you know, we blame God for them. No. He allows us within our own free will and choice. By me, God said, princes rule, and nobles, even all the judges of the earth. All the way down the line, all that deals with the conduct of men in whatever governments, how advanced or primitive they might be, they're ordained, they're set in order by God. And He has a purpose for it, a reason for that. Daniel 2, verse 20, a good example of this. Blessed be, Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are His. And He changes the times and the seasons. Now don't pass that up. He changes the times and the seasons. Now let's just pause there for a moment on that. A lot of times we wonder about our weather. And this year is different from what it was last year. And next year will probably be different from that. And strange and unusual and things going on that we never, even our people who study the weather, don't understand what is going on there. Well, God changes the times and the seasons. Why? First of all, for us to realize that He's in control. Sometimes He changes it to bring judgment upon sin. Sometimes He changes it to make us realize we need to serve Him. We need to depend upon God, not upon our ability to control whatever elements we think we might control. A lot of times we get to go along, whether it be a planting, whether it be a harvesting, whether it be working in nature, that we can control nature. The only one who can control nature is God. And whether we must depend upon God to deal with it. So we find that He changes the times and the seasons. Now that's beside our lesson here on that. But here's the main part that we're talking about for our lesson is, He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. King Nebuchadnezzar was a good example of this. Now, man, he was a powerful king. Had captured the Israelis, took them into captivity. And of course, you've got the example of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and probably a few others that we don't know about, but especially those four. Now, they were subject to the Babylonian Empire. But when it came to their belief, they stood their ground. They would obey the king in all of his laws, except when the law dealt with their belief. Now the king on one occasion wanted Daniel and the others to eat certain food that they thought was wise, and God told them, no, this wasn't, and they wouldn't do that. But they did it in a way that wouldn't upset the government and upset the leaders, and said, well, try us and see if we eat this way, if we're any better than the others. And they found out, well, hey, they are. They look greater, healthier, wiser in this. But then when it came time and the law came down from the king that you couldn't pray for a certain period of time, Daniel didn't obey that law. And when they came to arrest him, Daniel did not resist. Now, if it had been another law, and he had been accused falsely of that, he could have resisted that. But no, he broke this deliberately because it dealt with his relationship with God. And he was willing to take the judgment of that law to be cast in the den of lions. God protected him in that and showed God's power in that. It might be the same thing with you and your government. Where it comes and they say, no, you can't do this and serve your God. And if you do, you're going to be punished with this. Then you take your stand and accept that punishment and let God deliver you from that punishment, showing his power. Same thing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They would not bow and worship that image. They said they only worship God. And when the king gave them a chance to go back on that, they said, now we thought about this. This is not just an answer off the top of our head, not an emotional answer. So we thought about this. We want you to know that our God can deliver us from that fiery furnace. But even if God chooses not to deliver us, they said, we want you to know we're not going to worship your image. We're going to worship our God. So even though as we might take our stand on our religious beliefs with our governments, wherever they might be, and be willing to accept the punishment for that, God can deliver us from that punishment, or he might choose to let us receive that punishment and go home to be with him and have the witness that we would not change. We would stay true to God regardless of what is there. And so either way, involved with that and working with it. But God is in control. You know, with King Nebuchadnezzar, he thought he was the greatest, and he was. He was powerful. God made him like an animal. Eat grass. Lost his mind. Insane. Then God brought him back to sanity. And he gave praise to God. Regardless of the leader, how bad he might seem to be, God can change him. That we must believe and we must trust. But in the meantime, we're to be subject to these powers. Before we get into this verse, any question or comment on what was said so far? All right, now Romans 13, 2 and 3. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resist the government that you're in, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. Now, not only will you be judged by that government, not that you resisted it because of your beliefs, but you just didn't like it and you resisted it, you're going to be judged by that government as well as you're going to receive God's judgment upon them. So God says, when you do that, you're going against what I've set up. You might not understand, you might not like it, but that's no difference. You do what I tell you to do. We're serving him. Now, God doesn't say it that way. But that's the way we need to look at it as well. Realize, hey, who are we to argue with God? Whether we understand it or not, doesn't make any difference. We need to serve and be true to him And so when you sin against your government or resist that, you resist God. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Without the end, not be afraid of the powers to do that which is good, and thou shalt praise the same. Now God has set up governments to bring about some order among society. He didn't set up governments to get them to worship Him. What if God didn't have any, what if there wasn't any governments? Our society wouldn't exist. Well, the multitudes, even though they are now with governments, but without governments, we'd have more people lose their lives. And there wouldn't be any decency, any order whatsoever among society. Even in your most primitive societies that we've been able to examine in the past as well as in the present, involved in that, though they might not have an education such as what we experience and all of that, or have of all the modern technology or anything, but they do have a governmental rule within their society. Might not be written down, might not be a constitution such as we see it, but it's there. And they've got leaders that others are subject to. That keeps some decency and honor. Yes, sir.
Because Jerry, probably even the worst governments are better than complete chaos with the people in it.
Most so. Definitely. That's why God set them up. Right. But He knew if He left man alone, on his own, man would destroy himself. We destroy one another. We're still doing it even with governments, but even more so without the governments. And all of the societies that are involved in that. And worship, to adultery, murders, killings, and all of this type of thing. This is regulated by governments. I don't care how evil a government might be, there's still certain parts of morals that are regulated by that government within there. Might not be the best, but if they're not left on their own and bring about total destruction, but it's involved in that. And that's what he's talking about here. He said, rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. And of course, the understanding of what is good and what is evil in the minds of some people is another question. But basically, it is there, and that works with that on there. And so in Romans 13:4, for He, our rulers, the government, He is a minister of God to the good, but if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for He beareth not the sword in vain, for He is a minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Now, we understand the Scriptures, how that God spanks His own children. And if you sin and God doesn't spank you, then you could draw the conclusion, I'm not a child of God. But now, what does He do with all the lost? Is He just letting them go free? Well, there's no judgment on the lost because they're not His children? No. That's why He set up governments. So that when they do that which is wrong, the government spanks them. That's an arm of God in an about way taking care of that which is wrong. Now with His own children, He doesn't use the government to spank us necessarily. He can. He doesn't use the weather necessarily to spank us. He can. He just outright spank us on His own. And He will. Not only that He can, He will. Why? Because He wants to correct us so that we'll live a productive life, live a life that would honor Him, and that would help mankind. And the same thing is this basic principles involved with the government. He uses the government as a means to execute wrath upon them that do evil. It might not be all the evil that we would consider evil, but yet basically it is involved with that. And so in Romans 13:5, wherefore, because of that, ye must needs be subject not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. And this is talking about to Christians now. Now the lost needs to be subject to their own government for wrath's sake. They don't want to receive the punishment from their government. A saved person, not only must you be subject to your government that you wouldn't be punished by your government, but also for conscience sake that you would be obedient to God. For we read earlier in this that if you resist this, then you're going against God. So for conscience sake means that you're obeying God as well as you're not receiving or won't receive the wrath of God. So why doesn't God do something about the evil in our world? Have you ever heard that question asked?
Oh, yeah.
They say, hey, if you've got a God, why doesn't He do something to stop all this evil? Let me answer it for you. He did through our governments. That's the purpose of the government, is to put a curb on the evil in the world. And so He ordained it. He set it up for that purpose. And that's the reason why, even as Christians, though we might not have a Christian government, we're to be subject to it.
When the people asked for a king, God said, you've got one. They still debated with him that we want a king like everybody else has got. And he gave them one. And look what they got. They got Saul.
Again, where God works and allows us, He's got a boundary there. He allows us to work within our own will, and we suffer the consequence of it, or we can work in His will and receive the blessing of it, and very much so. Now, support your government. And so in Romans 13, 6 and 7, for this cause pay ye tribute, also for they are God's ministers, attend and continue upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. And I think you're fully aware of this, so let me just cover this pretty quickly. Jesus said, Matthew 17:24, when they were come to Capernaum, they that received tribute money came to Peter, and Peter said, doeth not your master pay taxes? You know? And so Peter went in and on this, and he said, yes, Peter did, for he talked to Jesus, and when he was come to the house, Peter was right to say, now, if I put my foot in my mouth again, does Jesus really pay taxes or not? Well, Jesus didn't allow him to think about that much more. Jesus prevented him saying. He knew he was going to question him about that. He said, what thinkest thou, Simon, of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute, of their own children or of strangers? And Peter said to him, of strangers. Jesus said to him, then are the children free. Now, we belong to the nation of God, but also we belong to our nation. And God said we need to pay the tribute. And so Jesus went on and said, notwithstanding, lest we should offend them, go thou to the sea, and cast a hook, and take up the fish that first cometh up, and when thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money, that take and give unto them for me and thee. Man, there's a whole lot involved in that. But the answer to the whole thing is, God says yes. You pay your taxes in that. And then on the other hand of it, God will provide a way for you to if you're obedient in that. Then in Matthew 22, 17, 19, tell us therefore, what thinkest thou, is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? This was a question asked to Jesus on that. But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, why tempt ye, ye hypocrites? And so we find then, show me the tribute money, and they brought unto him a penny. And a familiar statement that we quote quite often. And he said unto them, whose is this image and superscription? And they said to him, Caesar's. Then he said unto them, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, unto God the things that are God's. And that we're to do. We're not to overpay, nor are we to underpay. This is repeated in Mark and also in Luke. As you would look at those verses of Mark 12, 14 through 17, and Luke 20, 21 through 26. Now, people are to honor those in authority. And here's some one, and God spells it out in Romans 13:7. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. All right? Not necessarily we're honoring the person, but the office and the position they have in that. And so he says, now let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially they who labor in the word and doctrine. Those who are experienced and those who lead in teaching and so on, they're to receive honor and double honor in this when they're true to the Word of God and true to the teaching that's there. In 1 Timothy 6:1, lest let as many servants as are under the yoke count their own masters worthy of all honor, that the name of God and His doctrine be not blasphemed. We're to do the work for God, not necessarily for man. As we talked about that earlier, when we do that and give honor to the position we have, and to that position or that job in that, then we will not blaspheme the doctrine of God's Word in our relationship and that together. Then in 1 Peter 2:17, tells us that to honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. And then likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them, according to knowledge, talking about our wives, giving honor to the wife, as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. Your wife is not cattle, or something you own. It's part of you, your body. You're to give honor. And as we do, we receive the blessings and then we conclude this section of Romans on this. Love thy neighbor as thyself. And you cannot overemphasize this in 13:8. Owe no man anything but to love one another. And he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. And so in Romans 13:9, for this thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet, and if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Amen. When you boil it all down, all of our laws is really to come to that place where we're loving our neighbors as ourselves. And when you have that relationship with one another, then you're going to keep all these laws, not have to worry about them in detail on that. And so in Romans 13:10, love worketh no ill to his neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. How important we realize this in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 14. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And we've been talking about the law. The law doesn't save you. The law keeps us civilized. And where we help one another. And to fulfill the law is to love thy neighbor as thyself. When you don't, then you've got all kinds of problems with the law and with everybody else that's involved in it. All right, any question or comment on what has been said so far? Yes,
Brother Jerry, I know you took a